My pleasure to be with you, Siddharth, with all your attendees and with our very knowledgeable and thorough panelists. So, welcome David and Nitin. In your knowledge, how did the earlier pestilences like Black Death and Spanish flu resemble the pandemic we are going through right now? I'll begin with David. What are the similarities which you see, and how do you think these pandemics changed business and society and politics and economics? And what are the learnings from there in how will COVID play out in the next 3 months to a year? So that is the broad start.
Thanks very much for inviting me here. One thing we should learn from the so-called Spanish flu, sadly, is that it came in waves. There was an initial tragic burst of death in the early months of 1918, and people thought, well, that's it. But then it came again, much worse, later in the year, and there was a third surge in 1919. So one thing this should help us bear in mind is that we should be careful about imagining that we're over the worst of this current pandemic anytime soon. Another problem with that previous influenza was that many people didn't take it seriously. People were slow in some parts to lock down activities. There was a lot of cover-up, and sadly again, that's a problem that we might have in some areas of today's world. So one thing to watch out for then is subsequent waves. Both of these previous pandemics, the Spanish flu and the Black Death, had wide social and political implications too. I'll just mention one from the Black Death, which was that many people came to realize that the authority figures really weren't much in control. Many of the religious authorities were clearly out of their depths, and everybody could see it. And so it's one thing that helped to set the foundations for rebellions against the religious authorities in Europe. And it took a long time, but many historians trace the start of the Reformation to this appreciation by many people that the authorities weren't so strong. So perhaps in our own days, we're going to see a change of respect, that people who previously have a lot of respect will become to be realized as actually not being very effective. And those who are truly effective may see their stars rise.
So those are very good points. And let me, as a complement to what you have said, share this graph from Bergamo, where the pandemic struck very badly and viciously within Lombardy. And if you will see, the waves are visible here also, David. If you will see the spikes in spikes and then troughs and then again peak and again a valley and then again a peak and then again a big valley. And now epidemiologists have confirmed that these peaks and valleys coincide with lifting of the lockdown and the lockdown. That means at the top, nearly the top of the peak, the lockdown is put into effect, the cases come down, people think it's things as usual, their near and dear ones may not have been affected, they are not sensitized to how serious this disease is, the lockdown is lifted, and again comes the peak. They go out and again comes the peak. And similarly, so one of the big lessons which you drew is confirmed through this graph from Bergamo. Nitin, what would you like to add to the similarities between these pestilences and our current pandemic of COVID?
Thanks, Pavan. You know, what is interesting about the Black Death and the COVID-19 is that, in a way, they both started off in China and blew up in Italy before they hit the rest of the world, right? So China and Italy seem to be two interesting points in the path of the global pandemic, whether it's for the Black Death or it's for the COVID-19. It's coincidental, but also in a way reflective of the pattern of globalization and the flow of international trade then and now. So in that sense, we need not be surprised, because the overall, it's the point I'm making this point to highlight a deeper underlying reality, is that a pandemic or an epidemic is usually a coincident with a pattern of social and economic organization of the world. And you have a particular social and economic organization, pattern of organization. It creates a pandemic, and the pandemic then creates changes to the social and economic patterns of organization. And as David mentioned, changes your attitude towards politics, towards religion, towards ideas, etc. So in that sense, that's, the overall pattern seems to be similar. The geographic pattern is probably just a coincidence that happens in this case. It didn't happen in the Spanish flu. But we should, expect a similar trajectory of history, that we will see winners and losers. We'll see patterns of thought being challenged, authority figures being challenged, economic organization being challenged, and the balance of power between capital and labor. This is something which I'll probably deal with a little later, but the balance of power between capital and labor will also change. With respect to the Spanish flu, incidentally, although it killed a lot of people in India, the Spanish flu falls into a black hole of our historic memory. We are never taught about the Spanish flu in our history books. World War I is probably 1 or 2 chapters in our 10th grade and 12th grade history books. So the Spanish flu, being a part of the World War I time frame, sort of gets deprecated even there. So we know very little about what happened, although we were one of the biggest sufferers of that plague, of that epidemic. And it's only now that a lot of us are digging up on the history of the plagues as well as the Spanish flu. Just an interesting point of note before I hand it over back to you, Pavan, is that the legislative instrument that we have in India, the primary law that we're using to deal with COVID-19 was written in 1897 by the British colonial government when there was a big plague. It's called the Epidemic Diseases Act. It's a very, very small act. It's got about 3 sections. It doesn't run more than a page in terms of how long it goes. And it basically says when there is a plague, the government can do literally anything. And if you don't follow the instructions of the government, you can go to prison. That literally hands over massive emergency powers to the government. It made sense at that time because we had a colonial British government, but it does not make as much sense now that we have a democratic government. So probably one of the things we'll have to be thinking about once the coast is clear is how do we have a new legislative framework to deal with things like epidemics. Over to you, Pavan.
Sure. So some legislative reform or innovation is also required, keeping things updated. It's interesting that both of you have brought the angle of religion, and Spanish flu surely was considered a divine punishment, and even the Black Death was similarly viewed. Plus, the evolution of protocol to handle the problem was also quite rapid and oscillating. So whether to wear masks or not wear masks was a question then also in 1918, and so it is today. Closure, complete closure, partial closure, those are things still being debated. A lot of superstition also you spoke of. So there was cinnamon, there was aspirin as the magic cure, which was given in doses of 4 grams, which actually killed quite a few people who it was supposed to rescue. So these are some very important points of similarity between both the pandemics and this one. Coming to some positive effects, what do you think are the positive effects which Black Death or Spanish flu left? David.
Well, as was already mentioned by Nitin, as a result of the Black Death, there were other changes in society. Of course, it was terrible for the people who got killed. In some parts of Europe, maybe 60% of the population died. So it was terrible for them. But the ones who were left behind were suddenly in much more demand than before. There was as much land as before, but many fewer laborers to work it. So previously, Europe was dominated by a so-called feudal system in which people were tied to one bit of land. But after this Black Death, more of the nobles and lords from one area were desperate to get good workers to come, and so they raised the wages of some of them. And so there were people who eventually created what we now call the middle class, people with mobility. So that was a longer term change that took place. I'm not sure we're definitely going to get good results out of this. It all depends on how alert we are, how wise we are. If I look at the difference of the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, both of these wars were terrible, but in some ways the end and the peace settlements that were put in place after the First World War were much worse. They were a poorer reflection of humanity than what happened after the Second World War. Just to briefly go into this, at the end of the First World War, the victorious powers, for various reasons, decided on quite punitive measures. Germany was forced to accept reparations. Many parts of its territory were occupied. Lots of economic conditions were imposed. And it spread lots of bad feeling, which arguably led in time to the Second World War, the growth of fascism. Whereas after the Second World War, better principles applied. There was a move to understand the basis of human rights with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The United Nations was set up, as were other Bretton Woods institutes, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And although it's popular nowadays to criticize these institutions, they all did a lot of good in the world for many decades. So the response to crisis isn't inevitable, it's not preordained, it's up to us, up to society as a whole, how we're going to react. And whether ultimately there are many good consequences to this terrible pandemic or not depends on, for example, the kind of conversations we're having now and which are being echoed around the world. Can we have the wisdom and the strength to seize better opportunities in the future?
Absolutely. In fact, you're right that the peace which was plastered over the situation after the First World War left many burning embers below, which got inflamed, and things did not. The remedy was not good enough, and frivolous or ineffective, let the sores fester.
There is one more point I'd like to briefly make here, which is that one reason why the peace settlement was poor was actually because of the Spanish flu, arguably. Woodrow Wilson, the US president, had a great progressive history. He entered the war in 1917 with a 14-point plan to build a better world as a result, including the League of Nations. And his principles included not being vindictive to the conquered powers. So he turned up at the Paris negotiations, the Conference of Paris in 1919, along with Prime Minister of Britain, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of France, Georges Clemenceau. And sadly, Woodrow Wilson was struck down by Spanish flu, and he never was quite the same again. And afterwards, he lost many of the arguments, whereas people imagine if he'd been at his full strength and his full powers, he probably would have prevailed his higher principles. So that's an unexpected consequence, which we are not sufficiently aware of because we don't pay enough attention to the influence of pandemics. They're sort of airbrushed out of our study of history. We need to bring them back into our awareness.
No, that's a good point you make, because that also makes us send our wish for all the sage and powerful leaders of today, that they stay healthy so that they can drive their wills forward. So coming back to the positive effects of Black Death, one was this demographic correction made there were lesser mouths to feed, and because of which the agriculture moved away from grains to cash crops, which were saleable abroad for a better price, and also several business practices started traveling from Italy, the modern banking, etc., into other parts of the world. And another thing which happened was that conspicuous consumption was kind of arrested by social norms. There were norms which came up for even the height of the high heel which women's sandals can have. So this was emblematic of the fact that the society was saying, do not flaunt, do not waste, and so on. Your comments, Nitin, on the Spanish flu. Any positive outcomes from the Black Death or Spanish flu which you think which we may have missed?
See, I think the positive and negative is something which we can only decide in retrospect, right? Because for the people who lost out in the Black Death, it was not positive. I mean, it was not a positive effect at all, right? For the people who gained, let's say, people who were marginal artisans whose wages went up because of the Black Death, then it was a positive for them. But for those people who are, let's say, the middle class or the elite at that time, and who lost their livelihood and sources of power and prestige, it was not positive. So positive and negative would be a judgment you would make on a very subjective kind of yardstick. What we can say is that the ability of pandemics to change and to tilt the balance between various sections of society is profound. It's not like a 5%, 10% change. It's a 400% change or 1,000% change. So that's the scale of shifts which previous pandemics have caused. Now the question remains: is this going to happen in the current one? Now there's one big difference, Pavan, and I think we've got to talk about this difference before we go on to anything else. Is that the kind of technology that we have today far outstrips any kind of technology which we've had even 25 years ago, right? Even, let's say, 2003 when there was SARS, it was a very different world in terms of technological capability than we have now. Now, of course, pathogens like viruses also change. They sort of mutate and they become more and more advanced. But if you look at the exponential curve in which technology has changed in the last 25 to 30 years, if you want to extrapolate it, let's say the 100 years since the Spanish flu, the technological jump in human capability has been exponential, whereas the viruses and pathogens are still traveling at their own, Darwinian scale of evolution, right? So we've become far more capable than the viruses. And that, I think, is the biggest positive of this moment. It's not a positive about this pandemic, but it's a positive about this moment. I've spoken about some of the very interesting things. It used to take us about 2 to 3 years to develop a vaccine and another 5 to 10 years to test a vaccine. So it would, from the time you, determine what is a good vaccine candidate to the time when you actually implement that vaccine on a large scale used to be 5 to 10 years. Right? 10 years is sort of the median figure which epidemiologists will give you. Today, with this COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus, the genome was sequenced within a few days. A vaccine candidate was ready in 42 days. It went for the first clinical trials in 2 months. And if we can accelerate the clinical trials process, we'll probably have a vaccine in another year and a half, right? So we're talking about compressing what used to take 10 years at the minimum to about a year and a half. And if you find some ways to accelerate the way you can do, clinical trials. Now that seems to be a hard one, right? Because you've got to put the vaccine into a human being and see how what effect it has. You can't computerize that process. You can't simulate it entirely. You can do bits of it, but you can't do it entirely. Now that puts tremendous amount of power in the hands of human beings who are at the receiving end of pandemics. We did not have this during the Black Death. We did not have this during the Spanish flu. We did not have it during the SARS crisis of 2003. We probably had a bit of it in 2010 during the H1N1 kind of a pandemic, but we have it now. So Moore's law, when applied to epidemiology, when applied to virology, when applied to vaccinology, is giving us tremendous amounts of power. Now, it probably comes a little too late because that kind of power has not been matched with the kind of wisdom that we would have expected. After SARS, we would have expected the world would be ready to deal with a pandemic at a much faster and a far more efficient scale. We thought that the World Health Organization would be a far more efficient and reliable outfit. That hasn't happened, but the technology is there. And that, I think, is really good news.
Great. So you're right that positive is a perspective which you see through a particular lens. Positive for who? Let us call it positive side effects. Let us say, for example, the World War helped the growth of antibiotics and the discovery of antibiotics. And for example, the SARS crisis you spoke about led to more online shopping behavior in China. So I fully agree with you, and these are some, let me say, blessings born out of a curse, but the curse is very big. I fully agree with you. So I'm getting a lot of questions, by the way, so I'm just jumping forward after both of you have summarized in the next answer. How will COVID play out in the next 3 months to a year? David.
Well, I think the worst is still to come, sadly. I think there will be more waves, and particularly there'll be more waves in the third world. Some countries that initially had very small numbers of infections are now surging upwards. I do think we're far too early to congratulate ourselves that we're on top of this. So I see there's going to be many more tragic deaths and infections. It's going to increase the pressure on us all to figure out better ways to go forwards. I share with Nitin the hope that we're going to accelerate our medical innovations, that we're going to more comprehensively and more quickly roll out solutions. It's too hard to know. It's unclear how successful we'll be. But the best exit from the current lockdown strategies is if we can be confident who is immune from the disease and who isn't, and then we can more quickly spread around the vaccine. So I'm expecting there's going to be even more pressures on technology. More people are devoting their citizen science ideas into this. There'll be more faster trials, and hopefully this is going to see a turnaround there too. But then there will be a reckoning. Many people are going to say that various authorities behaved poorly. They had good words, but they didn't match their words with actions. We may see more rapid changes in politics than we'd previously expected. For example, I don't take it for granted that either Donald Trump or Joe Biden will be the president of America in 2021. It's still possible there could be faster changes there, as people say, we need somebody like Bill Gates to be our president instead. So let's wait and see how this is going to work out.
Nitin, what are the 3 things you think which which the government should do now in this time period, right from now to 3 years to a year?
See, I think the first and the most important thing is to balance the risk of an outbreak with the risk of losses of livelihoods for 700 million people. Right? I think that's one of the biggest differences between India and the rest of the world, where we have a big outbreak risk, but we also have a big risk with respect to the livelihoods of literally everybody. But really 700 million people are very acutely affected by the hard measures that we've taken to control this. So to the first order of the day, therefore, remains is how do you now get through with your daily life, restore as much of economic capacity, livelihood capacity of the population as possible, while you are still under the shadow of the pandemic. So one of the proposals we have made, and I think many other people also have made, is to localize the control measures at a district or a locality level and concentrate on hotspots. So if you see one district or one locality as having a lot of cases which are turning up, you would focus your control measures, lock down that district, put the adjoining districts on alert, but let other districts which are further away and further afield to continue with economic livelihood, right? And that's going to be the most important, and I think we're going to hear from the Prime Minister in a day or two on how that will go. But our recommendation always has been to color code into red, blue, yellow, and green, and focus on the red in terms of lockdowns and control measures, but allow the greens and the yellows to get on with life and livelihoods as to the extent that is possible. Now, this is a balance, and this is a very hard balance because you could be yellow as a district today, but you could become orange and red very, very quickly, in which case the government should have the ability to quickly turn around and impose control measures. So what we've been saying is that you need an ability to look at it as a knob, not as an on-off switch, right? Lockdown or non-lockdown is not the right way to look at it, but look at it as a knob that you can dial in, dial up and dial down according to what your risk is. So that's number one. The second thing is the government has to figure out how to deliver relief to a lot of people who are literally destitute now because of the lockdown, right? We are already talking about 40 to 50 million job losses in the last 4 weeks, probably 200 million people in the informal sector suffering serious losses of income, right? And you've got to figure out how to get these people out on their feet. And we are talking about spending as much as 3 to 5% of GDP in terms of cash transfers and relief measures to individuals and small businesses who can then get back on their feet as quickly as possible. The third is to align these short-term measures towards a longer-term reconstruction plan. Now, we know in India that we had a slowdown long before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us. And we had a bigger problem even before that, which was how do you employ 20 million people every year? Because we had a huge demographic dividend, but we were not able to provide livelihoods and jobs to 20 million on the scale of 20 million people every year. So now you've got to do all of these things together. You've got to find jobs for people. You've got to create an economic reconstruction plan, and you've got to get out of the slowdown which you had even before this thing started. So a huge economic package is required. This is something which I have called the Indian equivalent of a Marshall Plan, where on the scale of what the West did for Europe after the Second World War, where the state spends humongous amounts of money in building infrastructure in terms of reconstruction, building up capacity, building up healthcare capacity, both human infrastructure as well as physical infrastructure, in order to kickstart the economy and get it out of the rut. Now, here's an important point. The COVID-19 pandemic has created both a supply shock and a demand shock, which means investors are unwilling to invest in any kind of industrial capacity because they're not sure whether the demand will be there. And people are not consuming enough and will not consume enough because they're worried about the future. They're not very sure what's going to happen in a year or two. So you have a supply shock and a demand shock hitting you at the same time. And you've got to address both of these things together. And one, you can go, you can make a far more elaborate plan. But one simple measure which the government can do is to signal that it's going to invest a lot of money I'm talking about 5 to 10% of GDP in infrastructure over the next few months and years, which will give industry the confidence to invest and consumers the confidence to consume. It's going to be extremely difficult because you've got to persuade people that the future will be okay at a time when you're fearing that the pandemic will hit your district next. So it's a tremendous challenge, but it's something which we have to do. I don't think we have a choice in this matter.
I think you have beautifully contextualized the situation, that it is coming after what was seen as a slowing down of the economy. So it is coming with a comorbidity. And you have also said that livelihoods, relief and reform is what we should focus on. And you have also granularly told us what it can be. I will request Blue Circle to make sure that this advice in a gist reaches policymakers, of course, who you would be reaching in a very strong way, but we will also become a small wind beneath your wings. So a lot of questions coming. So let me quickly go to the 1 to 5 year space. Will the world become more local versus more global so far? And will the global pecking order of socio-economic power among countries change? David?
I think there will be some more localism, definitely. Many companies have been deciding whether they should invest in local automation or whether they should continue to outsource various services abroad. And with worries that travel is going to be restricted with various aspects of lockdown, there is greater incentive than before, which may tip companies into saying, let's have the services performed by automation, by robots of one sort or another locally, rather than being dependent on these global connections. I see other similar changes which have been discussed for a while but not actioned, also being accelerated similarly. There will be a lot of pressure to have factories, shops, deliveries, all managed entirely by automation, whether it's by cameras and by drones. This was possible before, but people didn't see sufficient incentive to do it, but I believe it will now happen. And so this is going to have some impact, definitely, on global trade. And maybe it's not such a bad thing that there is less transport than before. We do need to cut back on the amount of transport that takes place in the world if we are all cutting back on our carbon emissions. In terms of the global winners and losers, I think it's still too early to say. China is in some ways very respected for how well it has managed this, and in other ways are still feared for possibly covering up some of its figures and statistics. It's too early to say whether Chinese network, its Belt and Road network of ecosystem, is going to flourish as a result of this, or whether there will be separate groups, each with their own influence and power. I do accept what was said earlier by Nitin, by the way, that we need most of all speed and agility in this, because we're almost certainly going to see surprises ahead. And if we lock too firmly into any one process or strategy that may initially seem correct, we may end up being on the wrong route. So the countries that do well will be the ones that are able to act fast, that have got good systems in place, and in which the leaders can bring along their country by communicating honestly and authentically.
Great. So, Nitin, will the global pecking order of socio-economic power among countries change?
See, in terms of, let's unpack this, right? So they're going to be, at least at this point, we can look at, and David alluded to some of them, is there are going to be three concurrent economic reactions to this, three concurrent geo-economic reactions to this. Number one is an attempt to build things locally and within your national boundaries, so that you are able to de-risk it from international events. So make in India, make in Japan, make in Singapore, make in Malaysia, make in China, make in Nepal, make in Pakistan. Every country is going to try and do a make in their country, especially what they consider core and equipment that is absolutely basic, absolutely necessary, absolutely strategic. So you will see definitely a push towards domestic production, indigenous production of various things, from medical equipment to armaments and key technologies like computer chips, etc. Now that's one. Number two is going to be a massive reorganization and restructuring of global supply chains. Now, however much you're able to move production domestic within your shores, you're not going to be able to reverse 100 years of globalization, 100 years of economic patterns of development in terms of how different countries have acquired comparative advantages in different areas of production or in terms of procurement of raw materials, right? So you will still need to rely on the world. You will still need to rely on globalization to fulfill your supply chain needs, but you will want to restructure it such that you will de-risk it even more than you tried to in the last 25 to 30 years. Now, whoever was doing risk management for supply chains over the last 25 years really needs to be sacked, because the overwhelming reliance on China, right? It was just mind-boggling. As an electrical engineer, and I think David is also from the device and mobile phones industry. Diversity in receiving signals is everything. You would not build systems which are not reliant on diversity. And here you build global supply chains that are so dependent on China that it's not even funny. And we figured out that it's not funny now, right? So you're going to fix those mistakes and you're going to restructure global supply chains. That means a lot of the manufacturing opportunities that existed in China will be up for grabs. Countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia, Korea, Taiwan, and India probably can take the catch if we are nimble enough. So that's one big opportunity for government, and that's a big opportunity for industry. How much of the business that is moving out of China can we capture? And that requires us to do a lot of reforms. It's not funny. I mean, we've been shooting ourselves in the feet continuously for the last 25, 30 years. And if we stop doing that now, we probably have a chance to capture some of that business. But not all of that business and not all of those investments will come to physical countries. And as David mentioned, they will go into automation, right? And you will not necessarily have to do them physically in any one country. You could probably do them in your own country. You could virtualize them, or you could build them in robotic, using robots in places where labor is expensive, but capital can be invested in, which are, secure countries, which will give you good electricity, low political risk, low natural disaster risk, etc. So these are the three trends, right? And for India, at least, two of the three seem to be an opportunity, where you're talking about India being a market for 1 billion plus people. Even if you look at 400 million people having the ability to buy modern consumer goods, an economy that needs to serve 400 million people can have a very strong domestic focus and a domestic engine of growth. So that's one interesting opportunity for India. The second is, how much of this business can we take away from, how much of the business that is leaving China can we take in and become part of a smaller but more diversified supply chain? And the third is, what do we do about automation and robotics, which will certainly replace labor in some sections of the supply chain?
So both of you, I think, have said that globalization's influence will reduce. It will retract its steps, but it will not go away. So something like an upper layer of globalization with a lot of room to maneuver for political self-determination as well as localization. So coming to the next point, there are several questions coming to us which are coming from specific industries on my WhatsApp as well as on the chat. I will not go into those questions because Siddharth tells me that we will have industry-wide, industry-specific get-togethers also like this with experts like you. So let me go to generally, what do you think, which industries will do well and which industries will do badly because of the pandemic? David.
Well, we're using Zoom now. Zoom is doing incredibly well. Its sales are surging. Other companies that are facilitating people to be profitable, to be productive at home. Netflix, I'm sure, is doing very well, and other systems that broadcast entertainment. I believe that the companies that can deliver ed tech well, that's technology for education at home, are likely to flourish. Esports, for example, we are not able in many parts of the world now to exercise and play football outside as we might once upon a time, but there's going to be growing use of online games. My wife has just been invited by her local bridge group to play bridge online for the first time ever. So all kinds of online activities. Also, the companies that can deliver AI and automation that actually works are going to do very well now. Many companies are feeling hurt that they listened to sales pitches that AI and automation would improve their capabilities, and often the CEOs, CXOs feel that they didn't get what they were expecting. It's been disappointing. And so they have looked with some caution and trepidation at these sales pitches. Well, the companies that actually can deliver on automating and more and allowing people to do their businesses with fewer humans involved, I believe is going to do very well for them as well. So these are some companies that are going to do well. The government, they need to step in a few other places. In Britain, some of the railway franchises are effectively being nationalized again, coming under government supervision. There's also arguments that some of the airlines will need to effectively be nationalized too. So government will need to step in at least some cases to ensure that essential services which are no longer commercially profitable are continuing.
And Nitin, what would you add to that?
So I would categorize them as companies suffering a demand shock and a supply shock. Now, obviously, the companies which are susceptible, or sectors that are susceptible to both demand and supply shocks, will be the ones hardest hit. In my list, I'm just reading this from my analysis. The ones which would be most acutely hit, at least in the short term, which I've been 3 months to a year and a half, 3 months to 18 months time frame, would be financial services, automotives, consumer retail of non-essentials, petrochemicals, logistics, MSMEs. On the other side, the companies which will be least affected or probably positively affected would be telecom and online businesses, power, food and agriculture, education, and consumer retail of essentials. So these would be less vulnerable, whereas the other ones would be far more vulnerable. On the more interesting track are, anything in the healthcare sector is now going to be very interesting because of two reasons. One is, inevitably, there's going to be a global reinvestment in healthcare, right? This is in terms of pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, medical care, medical education, medical services, wellness services, ventilators, equipment of that nature. So you're going to see a lot of that take off. And also overall demand for healthcare professionals around the world, because I think a lot of people have realized that although you might have enough doctors when things are hunky-dory, you just don't have enough doctors when it comes to a need to surge for a disaster like this one. So medical professions, nurses, doctors, medical officers, etc., are also going to be a very interesting play. Now, there's one more reason to be interested about the healthcare sector, is because just like how after 9/11 there was a massive investment of government money as well as private money in national security kind of businesses, homeland security, national security kind of businesses, we're going to see that kind of investment coming into virology, life sciences, genetics, molecular biology, bioinformatics, and so on. So, people it's a very highly specialized field, but a lot of money is going to chase businesses and ideas and innovations in that space. Because, one is a natural reaction to the pandemic. And second, I think people have figured out that, moving into the future, you will need to have a strong base in these industries in order to have better healthcare and wellness for everybody on the planet.
Absolutely. So let me try to share this slide which I got, and I think both of you have really added to it. So these were this is a visual mnemonic for the viewers. So these are on the left hand side of the screen are the ones
we're not seeing it, Pavan.
You're not seeing it? So hold on. Okay, now do you see it?
We're seeing your email. Now we're seeing something, yes.
Yeah, I'm trying to, yeah. Now is it visible?
Fantastic.
Okay, so if you see on the left hand side are the industries which have been very badly hit, and on the right hand side you see the industries which are doing better. And healthcare surely is one industry which will really come up very strong. However, there are parts of healthcare also which might be hit. Not very large parts, but for example, pathology labs have been hit because of the closures. But most of healthcare, medical equipment, critical care medical devices, all this is really going to rise, and tomorrow's heroes will not be just the astronauts and the cosmonauts, but the epidemiologists also in popular imagination. Two other fields which have been hit badly are poultry and newspapers. And newspapers have been hit because of fake news, it is said. And poultry surely is being hit because of fake news, because it is not proven at all that this virus transmits through poultry. We are having a hit of 200 crores every day. This industry is going down. So great points. And also there were points which you were making, which both of you were making, have pointers and let me say prophecies as to where can the businessman put his money in the times to come. So how will family life change, and how will work life change in the COVID era?
I think that more people are going to realize that we don't need to work so many hours. We are discovering by being at home, both good aspects of being at home and bad aspects of being at home. We've been waiting for a long time for a reduction in the number of hours people typically work. John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, predicted as long ago as the 1930s that as there was more economic productivity, people would be able to spend more time at home and less time at work. And he predicted that within 100 years, the average working week wouldn't be 40 hours a week, but something more like 15. He did say, however, whether this will depend on whether we are willing to enjoy life or whether we keep on in some kind of rat race, always trying to manifest as much consumer products as possible. There is a possibility now that we have experienced more of the joys of working less or working at home. More people are going to say, actually, we shouldn't be working so hard for just making more profits and more salary. We should find a way to have a better work-life balance. I do believe that's going to come, but I also believe it's only going to happen if governments help it. Governments need to step up with cash transfers that were spoken about earlier. Arguably, the most important initiative that many governments could take is something called a universal basic income, which is that regardless of what people are doing, there is some cash coming to them unconditionally all the time. And that will give more people the option to work in a better way. Instead of rushing, always taking the first job that's available, people will be able to put more time into, for example, startups and philanthropic work. And so there is a possibility of a big change in work-life balance, but it's going to need more than just people's willingness. We probably need state support to help accelerate it.
Very good points. So you feel that we might come out of the rat race and enjoy life more. And also I feel the situation which was pulling us back again and again back into the rat race has also become less acute with less social interaction, that you don't have to keep up so much with the Joneses. So there are less rats to compete with. Perhaps that change in the ecosystem of man also might make him more inner directed and more leisure oriented. And
The Pope
regarding
Francis, by the way, in his Easter Sunday letter, which he released yesterday, also said similar things, that society has been on autopilot for too long towards consumerism, and it is forgotten that there are more important values. So he is urging in his letter that governments around the world consider more seriously universal basic income, and we put more priorities on humanity rather than just on consumerism.
Very good point. So I think we should have a discussion on universal basic income sometime, but I'll just end this little piece before I go to Nitin by asking you a question. Some people say that UBI is a part of the social safety net, and of course a highly evolved expression of social safety net, but they feel that the social safety net can also become a hammock. What is your view on that?
Well, it is true that some people, especially if they've had a bad life, if they've had a lot of hardships in their life, they will temporarily take advantage of money to become lazy. But I think the evidence on the whole is that most people don't react in such a way, especially once they've come through their initial period of being shocked and alienated and frustrated and fearful. Once they realize they have regular income coming in, the better angels of their nature, to use a phrase from Abraham Lincoln, will come to the surface. And that many people who initially might have been lazy in the response will start to express more of their good qualities. So I think being in a hammock is an acceptable short-term issue with this. I do believe that as more people are given the basics in which to survive, we'll see them creating businesses, we'll see them being creative in all kinds of ways, we'll see them contributing even more than they are receiving.
Agreed. This hammock has also produced some geniuses. For example, the lady who wrote Harry Potter, she was on social security. Coming to what you are coming to, how will work life change, Nitin?
Pawan, before I come to the work life, just some thoughts on this universal basic income as far as India is concerned. You see, we've done this study on the universal basic income quite a few times in the last few years, right? What you end up with is that if it's universal and basic, it's not income. If it's basic and income, it can't be universal. If it's universal and income, it can't be basic, right? So we have a problem in India, especially because of the demographic and the fiscal structure. So you have about 50 to 100 million people who would be contributing taxes into the economy directly and indirectly, and about 700 to 800 million people who will be receiving benefits from the state. Now, this has been the case for the last many years, and it's going to be the case for the next, for conceivable future, probably get worse. But, this kind of a ratio is very unsustainable to have any kind of a respectable universal basic income, right? I mean, if someone puts 50 rupees in your account every month, it's just 50 rupees in your account every month. It's not really going to make any difference to anybody's lives, unless, the most destitute kind of people. So we've got to figure out, better ways to make this happen. Now, I'm absolutely with David and others. We've had, working from home is a wonderful experience for most people, I would say in the middle class or in the service economy, because you get to focus on your work without having to go through the hassles of traffic and commute and wasteful activities which are part of the work. There are also good parts which you lose out, like cafeteria conversations, hanging out with friends, etc. But a lot of the overheads, the negative overheads, are sort of wiped out because you do things online. We have the luxury of it, but I think there are about 500 million people in the country who don't have that luxury, who have no luxury of working online. For them, the technology helps them to earn incomes. So if you're an Uber driver or an e-commerce delivery agent or a Swiggy delivery agent or a carpenter who uses urban services to get the next kind of business, so the internet is a way for you to get business, and that business can't be transacted online, right? You can't be a carpenter online, you can't be a cook online. So we have a different set of challenges for the 500 million people or so who are not part of this overall online broadband kind of an economy. Now, work life, I think one of the interesting things which has happened in the last 15 days is we've had Zoom conferences with high school classmates, with university classmates, with former colleagues, with your in-laws, with your cousins, with your nephews, nieces, etc. And I think that's made a lot of difference. People are coming together. There's a lot more of a bonding which is happening online, which didn't happen before the lockdown. So that's a positive effect. My kids have started online schools. Their schools have started classes online. And I wrote a piece last weekend talking about how the girls are really enjoying the online classes. They feel that there's fewer distractions and they can focus a lot better. They do miss school because they can't hang out with friends and do the activities they used to do. But from a pure learning perspective, they feel that the online experience is much better than the offline experience. So moving forward, I think the hysteresis of this will continue, because if people have noticed the benefits of it at such a large scale, there will be a natural incentive to try and continue this even after the coast is clear, whenever the coast is clear. So expect a lot more online education, expect a lot more of group conversations or apps that bring people together in the coming few years.
Okay, great. So in fact, you have added to my list of people who I should have an online party or get together with. I should surely have one with my nephews and nieces. That sector was missing. Thank you very much. So though I've tried to weave several questions which came up, there are some more, and which is why we will terminate this trialogue and straight away go to those questions which have not been addressed. I'll pick a few of them only because we'll run out of time in about 15-20 minutes. But first is, do we have the headroom to make all these investments, Nitin, in India? Do we have the headroom to make these investments given the state of the economy today?
See, the answer is obviously we were fiscal jam long before the COVID-19 pandemic hit us, right? Tax collections were dropping, growth was slower, unemployment was rising. There was very little fiscal space even before. So if you think conventionally, the answer is no. But this is not a time for conventional thinking, right? We are looking at this situation being equivalent to the Great Depression or the Second World War, the post-World War kind of situation in Europe, which means you will be thinking about a lot of Keynesian solutions where the government has to borrow a lot of money to spend on either relief measures or infrastructure development, healthcare, etc. Now, the good news is that at a time when there is a supply and a demand shock, borrowing money and having greater fiscal deficits is not a bad thing at all, because it's not going to have the conventional deleterious effects on the economy. So inflation is not going to go and rise. They're not going to crowd out borrowing from the markets and so on. So deficit spending is certainly an option. But deficit spending doesn't mean you break the bank, right? So you still have to cut down on unnecessary expenditure. You have to cut down on wasteful projects across the board. But you still have to invest a lot of money in infrastructure. So what we found, for example, is that every rupee that the government spends on infrastructure has a multiplier effect of about 4 rupees. So every rupee spent by the government earns the economy 4 rupees. But if you just put transfers, for example, just relief measures, cash transfers, the multiplier is less than 1. So a lot of the government money, which is deficit financed, will have to be spent on infrastructure, like roads, railways, highways, buildings, bridges, schools, hospitals, 100 new cities, for example. So that's the kind of things the government has to spend. And I think the big idea here is that there is money in the international markets. There is liquidity in international markets. So if the Indian government goes with a good story to say that, look, here's a big country, we are committed to spend on infrastructure, we are committed to fiscal discipline, we are committed to not changing the rules of the game when the game is being played, and here's a 20-year project which will give you a decent rate of return, I think India will be able to capture that money. So in that sense, India is in a much better place than many other countries in the world, but it requires the government to take the kind of actions that the Narasimha Rao government took in 1992-93, biting the bullet, doing the hard and difficult things, politically difficult choices, and so on. Again, the good news is the Modi government has a massive majority in parliament, is personally very popular, and the next elections are at least 4 years away. So the government does have the room to make these kind of structural changes and raise the kind of money that is necessary to be spent on reconstruction and redevelopment.
Surely. And coming to the nature of society, if it changes, becomes more directive, more planning oriented, state steps in more, and the state is not the most efficient at allocation of resources. And as planning proceeds, the individual choices also get crimped. So a question is, how much of loss of freedom is expected and we should be prepared for? Nitin. And then I come to David.
Yeah, see, as a person who has deep convictions about liberty, about individual liberty, I am concerned. Because the overall pattern is one where the state has to do certain things. The state has to, for example, put limitations on individual liberties, on rights like privacy, etc. So there is no choice. The state has to do it. But as people who believe in liberty, we should be extremely concerned. I think the way it will pan out is in the way things pan out in India, in the sense that the government will do what it has to do. Civil society groups, media, etc. will raise a ruckus and try to protect it to the extent that it's possible. I'm not sure of the Supreme Court, because you can take a coin and toss it and see what the Supreme Court will do today. But I think the overall mechanism of civil society and the state are in for a very interesting contestation in the coming years, because both have genuine reasons to overstep, if you want to use the word, because the state, for example, will have to, lockdown is a good example. It's a massive curtailment of civil liberties, but it has to be done. As a libertarian, I can't go out and say that, look, I believe in my individual liberty, I don't care about the curfew. I would be doing a morally incorrect thing, because I would, worsen the risk of the spread of outbreak. So the state is right for its part, and the civil society groups which are worried about individual liberty, for example, loss of privacy because of the apps which people are building, which the government data is, the government is collecting for pandemic control, etc. There are genuine reasons to be concerned about it. I don't think this contest will be resolved in any through a static process. It will have to find its own equilibrium.
Great. So coming to David, lot of startups. One of the questions which has come is the startup dreams have got broken. Many youngsters who had started off in their businesses are today wondering what to do, and also kind of mentally maybe preparing themselves to go back to a job and work for somebody. What is your advice for them, and do you feel that the typical boss-subordinate relationship will change now it will be not so suffocating and hierarchical and sometimes exploitative as it is today in times to come.
So startups usually fail, of course. Most startups, sadly, don't quite produce what people were hoping from. The trick is to learn from each of the failures, to fail forwards. I do think that society needs to support startups. It's a vital part of our overall vitality in the society that there are new startups. So we do need to put mechanisms in place to encourage people to work smartly on startups, which is why, again, I think there should be some public funds available. Not that people will live a luxurious life, but there can be some funding available to assist people get some income in that early phase of their startup. In terms of the freedom question, I just wanted to add one point in there. I think it's entirely right, the point that Nitin was raising, that we have this dichotomy. But I see there is a great opportunity for a kind of technology here. There is technology which claims, with some credibility, to be able to give us the best of both worlds here, that the algorithms are able to access lots of data and to reach conclusions about, for example, whether people have been near sites of infection without the privacy of the individual's data being compromised. So this is with technologies such as federated learning or decentralized data, zero knowledge proofs. So just as there's going to be greater interest in various medical technologies, such as vaccine development, I believe we're going to see a surge in interest in this decentralized data mechanisms. So that's one area in which I think startups should be looking at. So startups probably should look at different fields than maybe they were all working on before as well. There's a chance for them to reflect and reconsider, as well as society as a whole.
Well made. So basically what you're saying is that there is a chance that liberty or privacy may be at risk, but there is also a chance that technology would come to protect our privacy and liberty through blockchain and other such streams. Coming to one of our last questions, what do you think is the future of our what do you think is the future of capitalism, Nitin?
You know, I don't think you need to get too concerned about the future of capitalism. You know, at least for us in India, this is the only engine that can bring 400, 500 million people out of poverty in a generation. There is no other, you know, there's no other tool, there's no other engine, there's no other set of ideas other than free market capitalism that can take us there. We don't have the luxury of looking back and saying, oh, capitalism has failed us, we need more, I think I call this the English language non-filtering effect, because we consume the same debates as in New York, as in Scandinavia, as in Europe and the UK. We sort of believe that we are in the same economic situation as they are in. And therefore, the opinions and the judgments made about economic systems made in those countries apply to us automatically. They don't. Our per capita income is $2,000 a year. The US is at $60,000 a year. We're talking about being a desperately poor country even before the pandemic hit us, right? Just look at per capita income, for example. So the only way we can come out of that is through employing capitalism and making it work for us. Having said that, we've spent the last 25 years doing quite a good job about it. We've had, waves of liberalization, waves of attempts to build an inclusive social infrastructure around it. So in that sense, the Indian experiment with capitalism and a welfare state is a work in progress. And at least as far as I see it, I can't think of any other way we could use to get 300-400 million people out of poverty in my lifetime and in your lifetimes, right? So unless there is, something vastly different which can grow the size of the pie, as opposed to different ways of dividing the pie and sharing it, this is the only way we have. So what we have to do, therefore, is not so much agonize over the failings of Western capitalism in Western social structures, but worry about how do we make and apply those principles and ideas to the Indian context and get people out of poverty as quickly as we can.
So the person who has asked this question is also saying that the growth of socialism and capitalism has been cyclical. Whenever you bring more and more equality, the more powerful men, the more talented men appropriate all the society's resources, and this leads to very high levels of inequality. And then the state has to intervene to reduce that level of inequality by through distributive justice. And just to take this further, I was also reminded when I read this of Sun Yat-sen, who says that Karl Marx uh, may have been too harsh and extreme in his criticism of capitalism. So though capitalism has whatever you have said it has, and it is a strong engine for growth, it is to be combined with some level of distributive justice. In that connection, the reader may want to know that will this distributive justice, whether it is coming, you both of you spoke about UBI, and if it will change the complexion of capitalism rather than erasing globalization. We are speaking about of globalization retracing its nature and accommodating localization. Similarly, will capitalism also change its nature to accommodate a little more of distributive justice? Nitin.
I think a better way to look at the Indian situation is we've had a socialist welfare state since 1947. A better way to look at it is what are we going to do to ensure that it can continue to deliver the social security and welfare that it has been delivering and improve on those things. So it's not a situation that we've been a wonderfully capitalist country and now we've got to figure out how to redistribute that wealth. I think we started redistributing far before we became rich, and which meant that we had so much fewer resources to increase the size of the pie. So I don't think there's a tension or there is a cyclical effect probably in theory, but in the Indian context, I think it's really more about finding the next cash cow, the next growth engine that will continue to help us to support 300-400 million people, even as the rest of the economy tries to grow rich and go more prosperous, right? So how do you find the directions of prosperity that will allow us to afford the kind of social schemes and social welfare that we are already doing? We're not doing enough. Clearly, we are not doing enough. No, it's nobody's case that we are doing enough. But even to the extent that we are doing something, how do you find ways to be able to support that? That is the question.
So whenever socialism has been brought in to reduce inequalities, it has also somewhere led to lower initiatives by the enterprising class. So this is the context which that question had, but I think you have made a very good point there. So coming back to David, the last question is the sectors which are affected badly. What is your advice to them? What should they do?
Well, we all have to consider what to do with our lives, and it may be the case that people have to change strategy, change direction. On the other hand, I think that when you are in a sector that is doing badly, but which you believe actually deserves to exist and deserves to triumph, the skill you need there is the skill of politics. And by politics, I'm not just talking about collaborating with different people. I'm talking about influencing the decisions of politicians so that more support from the state is provided to address what is in effect actually a market failure. So I can tie my answer now to the fascinating discussion that was taking place a few minutes ago as to will capitalism survive? What is the future of capitalism? Of course, there are many types of capitalism. There is the one-handed capitalism, which just looks at the invisible hand, but there's also the capitalism that recognizes that the hand is also balanced with a thumb, the thumb of a state intervention, the thumb of a democratic oversight. The two lessons of economics, if you like. The first lesson is the free market often does things very wonderfully. The second lesson is the free market is prone to terrible market failures. And if you try to do economics without taking either of these lessons into account, you're going to fail. So the right answer is what we have long called the mixed economy. And arguably, the mixed economy might be the very best invention of humanity in the last century. It allows the titans of industry, the entrepreneurial spirit, to do wonderful things, but at the same time, it allows the state to address the market failures, things like insufficient attention to externalities, things like the problems when cartels or monopolies arise, things like the provision of a safety net. But the critics of this kind of mixed mode of capitalism, the ones who would rather have more neoliberalism, more laissez-faire, they point to you can have failures of the state as well as market failures. And they're right, the state is often very inefficient at making its decisions. And that's why in this time we need, again, I say, better politics. We're going to need politics that is effective and which avoids the failures of the state. And we're going to look at some examples around the world where the state is actually doing the right thing. It's lean, it's effective, it's not trying to replace the market in all aspects, but it is intervening in a few areas. And I look at, for example, South Korea as a great example here, in which there seems to be very effective government. It sets the overall direction for the economy and then allows a fierce competitive environment to get going. So to answer the question, what should people do if they are in an area of the economy where they want to flourish, but they feel that the market conditions aren't allowing them to do so? Well, I think we're going to need political help there. And it's going to come down to all of us to decide what do we really value in society. We're now coming to the realization that many of the people who are paid poorly are actually critical to the well-being of society. The British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, on being released from hospital yesterday, gave a rousing speech in which he said that Britain's greatest asset, it wasn't the financial city of London, it wasn't the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, it wasn't our great football clubs, it was the National Health Service. And we are going to have to decide collectively, are we going to put enough funds into the cleaners, the transport workers, the nurses, or are we still going to steer the lion's share of the economy towards the financiers and advertising executives? Of course, these people in finance and advertising do good and important work, but I think more and more of us are going to realize the balance isn't quite right. There has been a market failure, and we therefore need political pressures to ensure that we are wisely and effectively steering more of the state's resources into this kind of important investment.
Great. So I feel that what you have said and what Nitin has said about the society and about the industry can be loosely tied up into 3 points. First, you are saying not only the industry, the society itself is in a spot. So we should peep out to form a group which pulses the market and prophesies the trend through its observations. I think this is one such dialogue, and we had this big aim of understanding that there's a lot of congestion on the staircase of COVID knowledge. And we hope that through such dialogues, we add at least one more step to that long staircase. So peep out, and then what you're saying is venture out, what Nitin said, that dial up or down. Do not just think that the whole of the society has to sit at home, open the industries in green areas, open the warehouses, and see what is the impact. And if you feel that it is subliminal only, then continue to start provoking the economy which has gone into a hibernation awaken. So that is venture out based on this first knowledge of peeping out, and then roll out. So the state should roll out assistance to rehabilitate and reforms and facilitate growth in these new fields of promise. And industry also should roll out new plans of entering sectors where they feel that there will be enduring growth. And just as the society's rating of certain services is changing, for example, nurses and doctors, etc., nurses and healthcare workers, etc. Similarly, because the whole scale is tilting towards some sectors which show that they will continue to continue to show a steady growth, we should look at rolling out our plans that side. So lastly, I would add, I think Siddharth has a question, and so I will ask Siddharth to ask his question, and thereafter we will close this session. Siddharth.
So thank you very much for this session. I just have one quick question to ask. While it's been summarized beautifully and a lot of the questions have been answered, one such question is that how will industries that require close proximity of employees and workers with constant social interaction, or workers working in close proximity, how will they engage during a pandemic, especially in nations like India and other emerging economies? Or Mr. Wood and Mr. Pai.
Well, we can have some close interactions if we have better equipment. If we have personal protective equipment available, which is at low cost and high reliability, this will allow more people to mingle. We'll also get there faster once we have vaccines developed. So I think in both cases, it's going to be technology and enterprise that gets us there, whether it gets us with the healthcare solutions or whether it comes up with protective equipment. So let's hurry up and get this equipment available that will allow more people to mingle again quickly, but without being careless in the consequences, because as was mentioned right at the beginning, managing the exit from the lockdown is just as important as managing the entry to it.
Nitin.
Yes, you know, even in the short term, there are interesting ways this problem can be solved, right? One simple way is that you reduce the instead of having a 8-hour, let's say you have a shop which is open 8 hours a day, you now take only 30% of the load, but open it 24 hours a day, right? So you have a 24, you have the night economy as well, which allows you to distribute the number of shoppers coming in over a 24-hour period than an 8-hour period. So that's good for the economy as well. So you could do, split the demand over a longer period of time. If you're in an assembly line, you could run a lighter assembly line where you don't have 10 people on the shift. You have 3 people in a shift, but you have an extra shift and so on. So these are I would call engineering and design challenges which can be solved. But here's the important thing: wearing of masks, hand hygiene, testing, physical and social distancing are the tools that we have in the short term to keep the economy going. Now, these are not going to solve our problems 100%, but if we use masks, hand hygiene, social distancing, and testing in an environment where the government is also doing locality-based control measures, we will be able to get ourselves up and running to some extent, even in the short term. When I say short term, it could be in the next two weeks, right? So, of course, companies will have to put in place testing infrastructure, sanitization infrastructure, as David mentioned, in places where there might be close proximity to people at risk. You might have to provide specialist, apparel or masks and so forth. But with this additional investment, it is possible to get back some kind of economic activity going. It's not going to be 100%. It's probably not even going to be 60%. But in the range of 20 to 50% of capacity, I think we can bring online in the short term through some clever engineering and adherence to hygiene and control processes.
So, let me just summarize now and close the discussion. So basically, I would like to add one more point to what I just said. One was peep out. That means look out for new trends before the others. Venture out to repair supply chains and demand patterns, make them roll out and roll out your plans, and keep in constant state of feedback with your ecosystem. Keep listening carefully and sensitively to what the ecosystem is saying to keep altering your plans, which David said. So I hope COVID is a turning point for countries which have been cursed for centuries because of their age-old chaos, poverty, poor living standards, weak governance. I hope COVID, despite whatever tragedy it will bring, brings some silver linings with it for such countries who can catapult to a better standard of living. And I also hope that all those people who are affected can align themselves to the changing reality soon and productively, so that their lives continue pleasantly onward. Please stay safe. Thank you very much, panelists, for a quality dialogue, and we will stay in touch and hope to see you again. Thank you very much, attendees. Sorry, I could not take all the questions, but some of the questions I have slotted and I will pass them on to Siddharth. These will be taken up in the industry specific sessions. Thank you very much, everybody, and it was a big pleasure being with you on this webinar.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Well handled.
Thank you. Thank you very much.